Yeah, so I'm going to take the lead off Mark and say I'm going to try my best, but I'm probably going to go over as well. A big thanks to Jose for inviting me to speak at this talk. When he did, I got really excited and put a ton of data in, so I'll try and get through it as quickly as I can. But I've been set up by a whole host of great speakers so far that I think will provide some context to what I'll provide in a more applied setting with athletes, and I think it may answer some questions that Lewis and John asked earlier on from some of the speakers as well. So I think I wanted to give a little bit of context. So today I'm going to present around the energetic stress within combat sport events, particularly in those who are weight making or making weight. So to provide some context for that, what is that basically? Well, we have different types of weight making events. We have those sports, as Eimear mentioned before, who are weight categorized. So for them to compete in their sport, they need to meet a certain weight category allocation. We have those sports where it's desirable to have the best body composition possible for aesthetic reasons. And we also have those sports where it's advantageous to have an improved power to mass ratio. So given some examples in those contexts, for example, in aesthetic sports, we've got, say, physique and bodybuilding athletes, divers, skaters, ballet dancers. And then within, I suppose, gravitational sports, we probably classically think around cycling, but even sports potentially considering a power to mass ratio benefits in, say, football or rugby. Within weight categorized sports, we've got events that are non-combat. So as mentioned earlier, we've got jockeys, weightlifters, powerlifters, and rowers. And I'm going to focus more today on the combat sport disciplines, of which there are quite a few. So we've got the Olympic combat sport disciplines, and we've got the non-Olympic combat sport disciplines, and all follow different rule sets and regulations, and weigh-in periods and refeed periods, but all tend to have the same crazy goal of being as light as they possibly can in order to, I suppose, obtain a competitive benefit and advantage. In terms of culture around that, typically everyone I speak to always thinks that this is what they're trying to do, and pretty much this is what they're trying to do as well. But I suppose in terms of energetic stress and offering, another view of what these guys do, they'll engage in things such as deliberately making themselves sick, so vomit, taking, I suppose, medications and solutions to release any unwanted matter within the body. And then also, a lot of these guys undergo pretty extreme periods of dehydration as well. And me and Eimear have not had any interaction at all when we were getting our talks together. So when I seen that come up before, I thought that's great. What makes these a really interesting, I suppose, model of examining energetic stress is the flux in their body mass across different periods of time. So you can see here, this is a very famous MMA fighter, Conor McGregor, and within a period of 4 months, he's increased his mass, or reduced and then increased his mass substantially. So from this, I suppose, just to provide you with some data to highlight the context of what actually happens when these guys are left alone, is I just wanted to show you some data from a case study we did a few years ago now. And I can actually tell you who this is, because this idiot told everybody on planet Earth that it was him in the study, so we've got no problems with anonymity. But this is a very famous Liverpool fighter called Paddy, the Paddy Pimblett. He currently fights in the UFC. When we were assessing him, he was based in the Cage Warriors promotion. And what was interesting about this was he was making weight for a fight where he had to lose 32 pounds, so 14.5 kilos over a period of 8 weeks. And to coin a Liverpool phrase, sound fella, easy work, was what he thought. He thought this was going to be quite an easy task. And we just requested and asked, do you mind if we can track what happens when you undergo this process, to which he agreed, thankfully. So in terms of what we did across the 8-week period, in the initial baseline, we took measures of body composition using dual X-ray absorptometry and also summer skin folds. We measured a range of different blood biomarkers. We assessed rest and metabolism, and we also did a, I suppose, performance test of cardiorespiratory VO2 max. Repeated that halfway through the camp, and then prior to the week leading into the competition itself, or pre-water load, and I'll talk about what that is in a second. Then post-water load, we took the following measures, and then prior to him doing something called a weight cut, which is where they undergo a period of rapid rehydration. We took the following measures on weigh-in day, we took these measures, and then 2 weeks later, we sequentially repeated everything that we could. So in terms of what we've seen, these were the changes in body mass. And as you can see in I suppose the chronic phase leading into the first 7 weeks of the camp, the changes in body mass were quite modest. And then these become a little bit more modest in the days leading through. And then within this period here, he goes from 73 kilos to 65.7 kilos in 18 hours. Following this 2 weeks later, he then increases his body mass far in excess of baseline. And this is something that I want you to keep in mind, because it's some data that I'm going to show pertaining to what might be causing this later on. In terms of energy intake, for the first 4 weeks, he was eating in and around I suppose a caloric equivalent of his resting metabolic rate. Then for the following 4 weeks, around about 1,500 calories below resting metabolic rate. And then this was exponentially decreased until he actually weighed in. And then in terms of the water loading, what I mentioned before, I don't want to go into this too much because it's not pertinent to the event, but I suppose just to explain, these guys in the days leading into the fight, in order to, I suppose, play on shifts in fluid electrolyte equilibrium, ingest huge volumes of water in order to try and, when they then dehydrate, release even more water to make weight. If you want to know more about that, a good friend of mine, Dr. Reid Reel, from formerly the Australian Institute of Sport, did a nice study on it. So I'd say go and look at this paper. And then following this water loading phase, he then engage in these different methods of dehydration, from spitting in a cup to hot baths to repetitive sauna cycles. So in terms of the impact of this on body composition, what we actually see is a fairly steady increase in fat mass, with a fairly substantial increase in fat mass in the 2 weeks post competition. You see that fat-free mass, as measured by DEXA, remains quite stable, and then we get this large decrease in that 18-hour period, which is more than likely just an artifact of the dehydration process, not losses in fat-free mass per se. And then this is obviously matched then against what we see in the body fat percentage changes, which are quite modest, and then the summer skin fold changes as well. Getting into some of the real interesting data, what we do see from baseline in terms of resting metabolism is when he's ingesting energy intake equating to RMR, there seems to be a nice preservation of their resting metabolic rate. But when they go below that value, and this is the week prior to the competition, we see that kind of reduction, a classical reduction in RMR, and also, as Mark mentioned, the adaptive thermogenic responses in relation to changes in fat-free mass, which is rescued in the post 2 week period. And then in terms of VO2 max, so again, I suppose going back to Lewis's point about performance, we don't necessarily see any changes in this, and we actually see a reduction leading into the competitive event. And then he didn't want to do a VO2 max 2 weeks after he'd fought, so we didn't collect that data. And it must be said that this individual didn't engage in any structured strength and conditioning or I suppose aerobic-based training. It was all MMA training, so potentially those are mitigating factors. This is probably the most interesting data for me and more pertinent to the energy stress meeting. These are some of the data that we got in regards to the blood profiles that I mentioned earlier on. Starting off first with cortisol responses. So you can see across the camp from baseline in the weeks, even in the days leading into the competition, that remains at a fairly stable and relatively clinical relevant level. Whereas after the 18 hours of extreme dehydration, this increases almost triple-fold. What we do find massively interesting, I suppose, as a product of the energetic stress is huge reductions in testosterone. For my mind, and it'd be great to speak to some of the speakers today, these are some of the lowest levels I think we've actually seen in the literature for any human ever, which was quite surprising to us, considering that, you know, the energetic stress is, I wouldn't say it's overtly extreme, for example, like Mark presented in a Minnesota starvation experiment, but yeah, it's fairly modest when you consider that. From the perspective of I suppose the influence of dehydration on kidney function, when we look at urea and creatinine, basically we see levels in that weigh-in period post-dehydration that are indicative of acute kidney injury. And following this as well, when we look at the serum plasma osmolality and we also look at the sodium level of the individual, these are indicative of somebody who is about a couple of hours away from going into one of those. So just to highlight the extremes that these guys go to, and as I say, why they're quite an interesting model to examine energetic stress. So in terms of strategy for making weight, I've been fortunate over the past couple of years working with Professor Graham Close and James Morton to do papers in and around, I suppose, better alternate approaches to make weight. These are a couple. We very recently did an invited review for Jose and for Kirsty, with a particular focus on this in females. And to give you an overview of a way to approach this better than the habitual, I suppose, practices that I've just shown earlier, we obviously propose that based on a baseline of body composition, we modulate in the chronic phase. So this is more thinking about the months and weeks leading into the event, by playing on changes in energy intake and energy expenditure. And then in the acute phase, modulating that, I suppose, that total body water element, but being a bit more nuanced in the approach by maybe liberating bound water within the gastrointestinal tract and the muscles. And then that then allows us to be a lot less extreme when it comes to fluid restriction, and then also increased perspiration through sweating and things like that. But the focus of what I'm going to show you in the next couple of studies is not going to be around the acute phase, given the nature of the meeting today, is the focus around the strategy in the chronic phase of reductions in energy intake and increases in energy expenditure, and what that may lead to. So again, I know Eimear set me up perfectly for this, so I'm not going to cover this too much. Today I'm going to present a lot of stuff around energy availability. For those who may not be familiar, and I apologise if I'm teaching anybody to suck eggs, but what are the differences? Well, energy balance is the difference between energy intake and total energy expenditure based on a number of different components that are considered within that model. Energy availability differs in the sense that what we're actually looking at is the difference between energy intake minus only the exercise energy expenditure component of that energy balance model, and then dividing that by measures of fat-free mass. So from this, it's been proposed in literature that different levels of energy availability can therefore contribute to different types of, whether it be mass gain or hypertrophy or growth, mass maintenance or healthy mass loss. And there's this proposed threshold from some really nice studies that was done by Professor Anne Laux over a number of years, that a status of low energy availability, so energy availability equals to below 30 calories per kilogram of fat-free mass per day, can potentially lead to some of the consequences as we've seen presented by a number of the different speakers. And again, I'm not going to go into this too much because Eimear's already covered it, and I don't want to upset Neil. But one of the consequences that this can lead to, two of the model consequences, are the athlete, the male and female athlete triad, and also the health and performance consequences of the relative energy and deficiency in sport model. And what I would say, if you've got more interest in this, a shameless plug, not for me, but for my colleagues, read this fantastic paper by Jose, Harry and Karsten, which gives a real nice overview of the model of low energy availability, and then a bit of discussion around those two models of athlete triad and also REDS. So, going into the data now. Given what we've seen today about the effects of energy, or I suppose energy restriction on potential health and physiological and performance biomarkers, we did this study a couple of years ago now with the aim of outlining the health and performance consequences of a transient period of low energy availability on symptoms of triad or REDS in a combat sport athlete undergoing body mass loss. But rather than this being observational, this was interventional, and I'll run through the design now. So this was a Taekwondo combat sport athlete with the following baseline characteristics. And from their baseline body composition, we established that we thought it would be appropriate for them to not make the habitual weight category, but that they had the body composition to be able to safely and effectively make a lower weight category. And that would represent a 9.8 kilograms, so about 10 kilograms loss in 8 weeks. So this individual had basically said, as we showed with the other combat sports example, that they'd often kill themselves just to make minus 68. They'd have hardly any carbohydrates, they'd had mental breakdowns. So when we mentioned the fact that they could make a lower weight category, they weren't particularly enthused about that, but give them the due, they said, okay, we'll give it a try and let's see what happens. So again, similar to the previous case study, in this design, we measured baseline body composition with DEXA and summer skin folds. Examining factors related to that red spoke, because we wanted to see if this design had any effect on that. We also looked at cardiac function through 12-lead ECG and echo. Again, we looked at a whole range of blood-based biomarkers, rest and metabolism, cardiorespiratory capacity, repeated the skin folds weekly all the way through, the other measures halfway through the camp and the week prior. And then we also took measures of what we would probably regard as performance and psychological function from a linear encoder looking at power assessment measurements, also absolute and relative upper and lower body strength. And we did a profile of mood states and also semi-structured interviews. And again, we repeated those halfway through and prior to the end of the camp. Leading into the event itself, we took the following measures 24 hours prior to the weigh-in, these on the weigh-in day, these 1 day after the competition, and then 1 week post-competition, we sequentially repeated everything, and we took those psychological measures at all of those time points. So in terms of the examination of energy availability, because this is a really difficult thing to assess and measure appropriately, like I say, if you read Jose, Carsten and Harry's paper, I think that articulates that quite well. We were fairly confident that we had a nice assessment of fat-free mass, given we were utilising DEXA. But what about the assessments of energy intake and exercise energy expenditure? And again, related to what I've just said about how difficult that is, this is a really nice paper highlighting how difficult it is in free-living athletes. For energy intake, what we then decided to do in this design is basically provide all of the foods for the individual, for them to eat. And we did this using a food preparation company. And this was based around a macronutrients and I suppose energetic contribution of their rest and metabolic rate. So what we basically did from this is provide around 2.3 grams per kilo of lean body mass of protein, 3.4 grams per kilo of lean body mass carbohydrates, and around about close to 1 gram per kilo of lean body mass fat, which equated to their rest and metabolic rate, so 1,700 kilocalories per day. We didn't allow them to have any supplements throughout this because we didn't want that to, any ergogenic effects to potentially dampen or down-regulate any of the effects of the low energy availability state. In terms of exercise energy expenditure, so similar to what James mentioned earlier, we use the ActiHeart system. I won't go too much into how that works, but it's basically a combined ECG and accelerometry-based unit. Those guys are based outside, so if you're interested, you can go and ask them more. But we did some validation and reliability on this work prior to putting this in place. And from this, you get a really nice output where you're able to, I suppose, focus in and hone in on exercise energy expenditure for particular parts of the day. And then through tracking the athletes' individual training sessions all throughout their camp and getting their individual measurements also from a polar heart rate system, we were able to generate measures of exercise energy expenditure. And their typical training week looked like this in terms of 3 aerobic-based 45 to 60-minute runs per week, 2 high-intensity interval training sessions, 2 S&C sessions, 4 taekwondo sessions with 1 rest day. And from all the measures that I've highlighted earlier on and establishing measures of exercise energy expenditure, we were then able to establish status of energy availability, which at all time points throughout this was classified as within that low threshold. So from this, as we see here, these are the measures of energy intake. When we map this across exercise energy expenditure, what we're basically able to see is that in the first, I suppose, acute chronic phase, they were between a range of 30 to 6 kilocalories per kilogram of fat-free mass per day. Whereas in the week leading into the competition, they were in, which is an average of 20 kilocalories per kilogram of fat-free mass per day. Whereas in the acute phase going into the weigh-in, they were in a range of around about 10 kilocalories per kilogram of fat-free mass per day. And on some days, they were actually in negative energy availability. And then following this, when they had a free period of their own eating and training, that obviously went up quite positively. Something else we measured within this as well as energy availability, is this concept of within-day energy balance. And so obviously we mentioned energy balance earlier on. Within-day energy balance is proposed by Dr. Don Barnado, And it's this idea that we're never in I suppose, a constant day-by-day status of energy balance, that this fluctuates hour by hour, day by day, week by week, month by month. And there's periods where we've got times of surplus and times of deficit, and we need to understand I suppose, the magnitude of those. And dependent on whether we're in surplus or deficit, we're either anabolic, balanced, or catabolic. So again, robbing some brilliant methodology from Monica Torstvedt and Anna Mellon, we actually did within day energy balance assessments, hour by hour, day by day. I say I did it. James Morton made me do it for every day for 8 weeks, which wasn't fun, but we got some real nice data, which I'll show you all shortly. So in terms of total body mass, conversely, in relation to the MMA fighter we showed earlier on, in the chronic phase, the first 8 weeks, we actually see a larger reduction in mass, whereas in the acute phase, we see a more modest reduction in mass. But interestingly, in the post, I suppose, recovery phase, we see that rebound in mass, which I'll talk about a little bit later on. In terms of what that looked like for sum of skin folds, fat mass percentage, and then measures of fat-free mass and also DEXA measured fat mass, we see that the fat mass losses in this individual were a lot higher than the MMA fighter. And again, we've got a nice, steady, consistent value for fat-free mass, so no losses of fat-free mass, apart from in the week where they're deliberately dehydrating, which is more than likely an artifact of total body water losses. So, what were the effects of this on the spokes on the REDS model? First of all, examining the metabolic effects. So what we see initially, and we look at this from the perspective of this is measured rest and metabolism using indirect calorimetry, and then this is predicted RMR using the Cunningham equation. What we see here is that this is the RMR ratio, which is the ratio and the division between the two of these. What we actually see is in the first, I suppose, 4 weeks, not much of a change in terms of overall rest and metabolism. Going into the following 7 weeks, not too much of a change yet again, but in only 5 days in that acute phase of being in some days of negative low energy availability status, we see a large reduction in measured RMR. What that looks like in terms of changes related to lean mass, as Mark mentioned earlier, so adaptive thermogenesis again is quite modest in the initial phases, up to 100 kilocalories, but a lot larger in that acute phase when we go quite low on the energy availability. In terms of the endocrine responses, so again, looking at cortisol, fairly consistent across all of the time points within the design. And then this is the line is testosterone. Again, looking at those first 7 weeks, we see a reduction from 21.5 to 11.2 millimole per litre, but still within clinically relevant markers. Whereas in the week leading into the competition, the acute phase, we then see a drastic reduction. And then within only 48 hours, we see that rescued and then rescued back to baseline after only 1 week. And then this is a fairly similar, story that we see across other reproductive function markers in relation to, say, luteinizing hormone, sex hormone binding globulin, follicle stimulating hormone, and insulin-like growth factor. In terms of cardiovascular responses, with a particular focus on the heart itself, what we do see is left and right ventricular structure and function remains relatively unchanged. So the low energy availability status didn't have an effect on that. And in terms of cardiac output mapped against heart rate, we see that classical reduction. Basically, this is just an athlete who's getting fitter through camp. The increase here is more than likely just an artifact of the modest dehydration he did to make weight. But again, overall, the message is we don't see any effects of low energy availability status on that cardiac function. In terms of bone health, and I need to be very careful here, thankfully Craig's not here because he would tell me off for presenting DEXA data in short periods of time. But when we look at whole body, hip and lumbar DEXA data, we don't really see any changes on either bone mineral density or bone mineral composition. And looking at this from a biomarker point of view, beta CTX markers at all time points throughout the intervention, including the recovery period, were above, I suppose, what we would regard as baseline levels of bone reabsorption. However, markers of bone formation in P1NP So should I say, yeah, these were all above the reference level of what we would be happy with for reabsorption, but P1NP was far in excess of what we would be happy with for bone formation. So when we look at the ratio of bone turnover at all these time points, this individual's in a positive bone turnover. In terms of psychological function, again, these are some excerpts from semi-structured interviews, and when we look at profile of mood states and total mood disturbance score, we see that classical iceberg profile, other than the red line when they were doing the dehydration because they weren't too happy about that, and then that goes back to the same classical profile as we see from baseline. So again, no real overt effects on psychological function. And then finally, looking at some performance-based markers in the model. So we didn't see any depression or irritability, as we saw from those psychological assessments. And then in terms of performance from a strength and power basis, what we see here is that both upper and lower absolute and relative strength increase throughout the intervention, and both upper and lower power profile also increase throughout the intervention. And then interestingly, we see an increase in both absolute and relative cardiorespiratory function as well. So again, it didn't appear that this low energy availability status seemed to have an effect. Another thing just to add is that the individual athlete won the competition that they entered, so they ended up qualifying for the European University Games, so another, I suppose, performance metric. And a quick summary around this is that obviously making weight in combat sports can be achieved successfully without those deleterious effects that we saw earlier via restricted energy intake according to the daily demands of training. Despite the consistent period of LEA in this case study, we didn't see any consequences of triad or REDS on either tested or competitive health and performance markers until energy intake was reduced below those requirements of RMR. And just briefly, I'm just going to show you a quick bit of data, a very quick bit of data, because a criticism of this study was that the period of LEA exposure was quite short. So even though it was across 8 weeks, we got quite a lot of criticism of people saying, well, it's only 8 weeks, and that males are less susceptible than females. So I'm just going to very quickly, for the next few minutes, show you some data that we've completed with the same design in a female athlete for 2 years. So hopefully we don't get as much criticism with this. This athlete is a fighter who competes in the UFC, which is the Ultimate Fighting Championship, so I suppose one of the highest promotions in combat sports, so a full-time professional athlete. Again, we did the same design in terms of body composition assessment. This time we included bioelectrical impedance, cardiac measures, blood-based measures, rest and metabolism, and cardiorespiratory function. Repeated that halfway through the camp and the week prior to the camp. We didn't do any assessments with this individual in the acute phase, so this is only looking at when they're making weight in the chronic phase. And again, we took the same performance measures as I mentioned earlier on in terms of power, strength, and psychological function. The 2-year assessment was done across 6 consecutive camps from 2019 to 2020 and early 2021. Unfortunately for us, I should mention, so this is 110 weeks, which is 48 weeks or 45% of the time spent at a threshold of low energy availability. But unfortunately for us, as with the rest of the world, halfway through or a part of the way through this, COVID hit. So I'm just going to show you some of the data related to, I suppose, the first camp, the middle camp, and the second camp, and how this may have affected things. We took the same design as we mentioned earlier on. We provided all food to the individual athlete. This was based around the caloric requirements of rest and metabolism, and similar protein, carbohydrate, and also fat quotients to equate to their rest and metabolic rate. In this case study, though, we did allow them to have supplements, not in the form of any ergogenic aids, but in terms of carbohydrate supplements. And the reason why we did that is because across the weeks, we clamped protein intake day by day at that same quotient that we saw earlier, and also fat. But dependent on the training severity, so Tuesday and Thursdays were the harder training days, we went higher in carbohydrate intake, around 6 grams per kilo body mass. 6 grams per kilo of lean body mass per day. On moderate training days, around about 4 grams per kilo of lean body mass per day. And then on recovery days, we went low, so down to 2 grams per kilo of lean body mass per day. So we did this in like a periodized approach. And again, I'll just give you an overview of the training of this individual athlete. Again, they wore an ActiHeart accelerometer for us to capture energy expenditure, and we can see that with the periodized approach, they're in a status of low energy availability, but it's a little bit more modest with less of a range. So again, I know Kirsty's going to be angry at me, so I'm going to be really quick with this and show you very quickly. So changes in body composition, again, similar to the male case study, camp to camp, we see changes around about 6 to 7 kilos. In terms of what that looks like in fat mass, we get fairly consistent reductions in fat mass, which is indicative of reductions and changes in percentage fat mass. We actually see that lean mass and skeletal muscle mass measured by DEXA and BIA remains consistent and also deliberately increases in certain parts of the camp as was deliberate as part of the S&C intervention. And these changes were independent of any, I suppose, relative or total changes in total body water. And then finally, the effects that we see, so effects on, I suppose, endocrine and menstrual function. So 4 key measures in terms of estrogen, progesterone, luteinizing hormone, and follicle-stimulating hormone. What we see is that throughout the entire 2-year period, the athletes had regular menses all the way throughout, so 10 to 11 menses, no shorter than 26 days in length, no longer than, I think, 32. And when we look at these profiles in terms of estrogen, progesterone, luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone, they indicate a eumenorrheic individual. So we don't see that effect of low energy availability status on menstrual function. In terms of metabolic effects, again, this is measured resting metabolism, this is predicted resting metabolism, this is RMR ratio, we don't see any effect. And again, when we look at this in terms of thyroid-stimulating hormone and also free triethynine and thyroxine, we don't tend to see any effect of the low energy, consistent, repeated periods of low energy availability status on those measures. Cardiovascular function, again, very similar. Across all of the time points, we don't see any effect on left or right ventricular structure or function. And again, we didn't see any effects other than training effects on either cardiac output or also heart rate. Bone health, very similar again, whole body. I'd be okay with this, Craig would forgive me for this because it's a bit more longitudinal. But in terms of DEXA, we see a positive bone mineral density and bone mineral composition across all time points. And then in terms of the earlier measures that we saw, it's a very consistent message of, we see that across all time points, beta-CTX, so bone reabsorption is very high, but this is offset by bone formation in P1NP being higher, ergo having a higher or a positive bone turnover. And then finally, for psychological function, a very similar story to the male case study where we don't see any negative effects on psychological function through profile of mood states, total mood disturbance score, or the excerpts that you can see on the right. And then just some very, very brief performance outputs. Again, in terms of overall strength, we see from camp to camp, year to year, lower and upper relative and absolute strength increases. Haven't analysed this data yet, but power is also consistently increasing. And then in the first camp versus the final camp, we see that absolute and relative cardio-respiratory function also increases. So, just to summarise again, making weight in combat sports athletes can be successfully achieved, but this time in a restricted and periodized manner, independent of the clamp manner we saw earlier on. Once again, despite those repeated periods of LEA, we didn't see any negative consequences. And then data from this case study may support some of the recent evidence that we see highlighting that threshold of LEA may not necessarily lead to consequences of triad or REDS for everybody. But we do acknowledge these are only case studies and we need obviously more cohort-based studies and, as Eimear said before, different magnitudes, different time phases to try and get a greater understanding of this in both males and females. And very, very quickly, if you give me 60 seconds, very quickly, I know I'm eating into coffee time, but I think you might find this important. What we did see, and Marcus set me up perfectly, in the male case study data, because if you remember, we tracked the male for a week after the competition, is a little bit of an alarming rebound hyperphagia response. So within daily energy balance measurements that I mentioned earlier on, these are basically the energy intakes in the bars and then the within day energy balance values that we see across the camp leading into the event itself. So because we clamped energy availability at 1,700 kilocalories per day, this is what it equated to per week, and this was basically the within daily energy balance, so nearly negative 95,000 calories. or sorry, I should have said negative 105,000 calories once they'd made weight. After a period of eating in the week following the competition, nearly 33,000 calories, this is only rescued to a value of negative 95 or 96,000 calories. And the effect of this, these are the type of foods that the individual athlete and drinks that they were having after the competition. They were having a good old time with themselves, particularly drinking lots of this stuff because they won the competition. The effects of this were quite deleterious in only a 7-day period. We were really shocked and surprised. Most notably, when we looked at cardiorespiratory function, so the yellow bars are energy expenditure, but this is maximal fat oxidation at baseline. 8 weeks, so at the end of camp, so you see an increased profile. 7 days later, massively suppressed. Additionally, and I found this quite shocking, is this is the baseline fasting insulin for the individual across the intervention period leading into the weigh-in, and then this is 48 hours after the competition. And then this is a week after the competition. So that represents hyperinsulinemia, which is nearly 450% above baseline. When we look at total cholesterol, HDL, LDL, we see profiles that the doctor wouldn't particularly be enthused with after a period of 7 days refeeding. And then what was really interesting, and this is where I think I need to have a conversation with Mark, is the athlete consistently mentioned that they were constantly hungry all of the time, and all they could think about was eating constantly, independent of changes in fat-free mass. So we know, as Mark mentioned, that there may be signals from adipostats and proteinostats driving this. This potentially could lead to subsequent weight regain in middle age. And we've just recently done a study examining this, and again, another case study intervention in a boxer. And the worrying thing is independent of these guys not necessarily seeing a lot of effects within camp from low energy availability. And this is our friend Paddy the Baddie again. This is what he looks like in the cage, and this is what he looked like 2 or 3 weeks later. And just to give a little bit of a plug, we're currently in the process of putting together a case study where we've tracked a fighter from 2004 until now and looked at their body composition change in relation to energy intake. And this fighter basically is put on 40 kilos, and the energy intake values aren't necessarily that different. So lots of interesting data to come. Apologies for overcoming. You're definitely going to need a coffee now. Just leaves me to say thanks to all my colleagues in LJMU, particularly Professor James Morton, and be happy to take any questions. Thank you.